In this video, I want to try something a little different. I want to link photographic discussion with the actual process of taking photographs for a project. For a number of years now, I've been working on a project that focuses on the west coast of South Africa. It's called Rough Diamonds. It centers around people and places within a small strip of land that is only vaguely habitable. It sits between the desert or semi-desert and the sea. I'll also talk about the process of developing an approach or attitude to these trips that will maximize the value for your photographic project. There are really only three things that draw people to this region. There's low yield farming. It's a low rainfall area, so the land can't sustain much livestock. So there are huge farms with a few goats and sheep and cattle. The second industry is fishing. All the way along the coast, fish factories have been built, but over the past 2 decades, many of these have closed down. The third industry, and probably the one that defines this area as unique, is the diamond industry. I've been standing around trying to get a few minutes to talk to you within this clump of flowers, but it isn't happening because my car's parked on the side of the road and every tourist and their dog just stops and has a look what I'm looking at, and then they get out of their car and pose and take snaps. So I'm going to head off to a more isolated spot and talk more about what my plans are for the trip. I'm heading up north, but I thought it was worth just stopping here and just showing you how beautiful it can get in spring. The big river to the north of South Africa, at the far north, is the Orange River, and the diamonds would get collected by the river and get deposited into the ocean. And so this happened over centuries. 20 years ago, you had to get a permit just to be there, and you couldn't wander around freely. But I'm going to go up and photograph it, and I thought I'd take you along with me. The first thing that you as a photographer need to decide is, what do you want to get out of this trip? Personally, I have to work alone because I don't want to be distracted by things like what are we going to eat and where are we going to stay. These trips for me are pretty focused because they're fairly rare, and I stay on the program until I'm too tired or it gets dark. Others do it differently, and that's fine, but you need to set a goal for the trip. In this case, I'm primarily interested in seeking out portraits of people that live and work in these areas. But at the same time, if I find subjects that feed into the story, then I'm going to pursue them. The second factor that you need to nail down is your approach to photographing. You don't want to find a subject that's amazing and then have to start thinking, okay, what should I do with this? In order to take photographs that work within a broader story, you need to know why you are adding a particular picture to the project and how you want it to look. You want to land up with something that works as an individual photograph, as well as adding something and fitting into the general feel of the story. You can think of it like building a poem. Each word and each line needs to work together with all the others in order to communicate a kind of broader feeling or idea. The way the words are put together, the rhythm of the words, everything needs to blend into a cohesive whole. There's also a film-movie analogy that might be useful to hold in mind. You can't just chuck a whole lot of images together and hope the viewer will make sense of it. You need to use visual tools to link images together, and also you need to create rises and falls in the tension, so the viewer isn't consistently hitting the essay at one level. You want to vary it. So spend time with the images that you've already made before you head out. You then have an idea where the gaps are or what type of images are needed to add depth to the essay. When you are out on the road, the process then becomes a lot more focused. On this first day, I drove about 500 kilometers, and as the light was going, and that's pretty usual, things start to get more interesting. So I haven't given much thought to accommodation. This settlement is called Steinkopf, and there aren't any B&Bs and hotels, but I've just been sitting in the car in the dark, and I found someone who runs a wildflower tour company, and they've agreed to put me up for the night. So I'll continue this in the morning. I'll include a few images that I think have something going for them. This first image says something about the unfinished nature of many of the structures in this area. The second image shows plastic cool drink bottles being used as a public area decoration. It shows the level of poverty because the people have used, this really cheap option to beautify their town. Within this image, there's diminishing perspective in the shape that they've created. And I felt that it could complement an image that I produced some months before. It's of a somewhat bleak garden scene. This is an example of where you can hold in mind the visual aspects of photographs that you've already done, so that if you come across something that builds links between images, you can add richness to the final essay. After a quick cup of bad coffee, I'm keen to look about the village and see what it looks like in the morning light. And then I'll be heading off down the last 100-kilometer stretch to my first coastal stop, called Port Nolloth. My final destination will be the diamond town of Alexander Bay, but that'll be an adventure for another day. I came across this. There's always weird things that have potential to be interesting. But for my purposes right now, they don't fit the story. My sister who lives in Perth, Australia, is continually telling me to take nice, pretty pictures of flowers or scenic landscapes. But I find that if I fiddle about doing this kind of thing, I lose focus. This is about 20 kilometers from the coast, and you can see that the landscape is starting to change. The colorful flowers are beginning to thin out, and the dry, sandy landscape is taking over. There's a harsh beauty about these places. It's unforgiving in many ways. For the people living here, they are 7 hours drive from the nearest deli or decent cappuccino. So if you're reliant on visiting the mall, then this isn't going to be the place for you. Fish and chips is probably the most sophisticated takeout. I've secured a self-catering cottage for 2 nights, so I can concentrate on photographing around this town. And tomorrow I'll head up north to Alexander Bay. They don't have accommodation there, so I'll just make it a day trip. I've driven about as far north as one can possibly go. Behind the camera is Namibia, and dividing the countries, South Africa and Namibia, is the Orange River. This town that you can see behind me is Alexander Bay, and it was started to dig the diamonds out. The alluvial diamonds come down the Orange River. So this was a high security area and you needed a permit to come in. But they've moved the operations out to sea, which is a kilometer or so in that direction. You can see the desert stretches for kilometers. In fact, it's desert or semi-desert for probably a half the country in the easterly direction. So this is the end of the travels. I'm trying to get pictures of people who inhabit this really harsh environment. These accumulated piles of rocks were left behind from the alluvial diggings, and an abandoned camp is slowly disintegrating in the background. Nobody bothers to rehabilitate the landscape here. They just pack up, move on to a richer diamond location. This is the longest river in South Africa, and in the background is Namibia. The nearest town on that side is called Oranienburg, and the country was previously known as Southwest Africa, and it was a German colony during the colonial era. Diamonds were first discovered around the mouth of the river in 1908, and initially the area was strictly managed by the government. But these days the big operators have moved offshore. On this side, the town of Alexander Bay is slowly dying. The fresh river water allows farmers to irrigate a small strip of land along the shoreline of the river. But because of the distance to market, it becomes impractical to have large-scale farming operations. When the Orange River comes down in flood, it collects everything in its path. Recently there was a huge flood, and the river transported these huge tree trunks and deposited them in the fields. So they've had to remove them so they could revive the crops. So looking at this, it's easy to imagine how over the millennia, diamonds from kimberlite pipes, the rivers would have run over the pipes and collected the diamonds and then transported them down to the river mouth. At this point, the sea currents would have pushed them about and eventually buried them under the sand. Even the coastline is inhospitable. It's rough, and it isn't the type of scenery that would attract tourists. In the early part of last century, there were areas up north where prospectors were literally picking up diamonds off the desert floor and becoming instantly rich. But when the government got wind to this, they clamped down on access. In order to work on the smaller diamond vessels, you really have to have big cojones. You can spend hours freezing underwater with a thin pipe connecting you to the oxygen supply. I know someone who did this job for years, and eventually they got caught with their foot under something underwater. He was dragged up to the surface and his heart had stopped. But eventually they managed to revive him and get his heart beating again. So no cappuccinos, plus a job from hell. So you're not getting a lot of urban job seekers coming up this way. The people that are left in this town remember when it was a vibrant place, but now they are mostly eking out a living. The structure in the top left is an abandoned diamond sorting house, and it's probably the only multi-story structure in the area. The next day the clouds rolled in, so I was forced to head home. The experience of doing a photographic road trip is a bit like diamond digging. Mostly it's just logistics, but there is that fantastic feeling when you look and then you eventually find a kind of photographic gem. You come away from the trip feeling like you're potentially picture rich. Of course, one can only get an accurate idea of your success after looking at the new images together with the work that you've already done. Thanks very much for joining me on this adventure. Please like and subscribe because it really helps, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
Is it over yet?
This is good. It really is.
What are they?
Well,
and find out what the future holds in store.
Is it over yet?